All right, so we've set up our front end, but before we go about creating each of these components that we've added here, what I want to do first is set up the back end for our application. And in order to do that, well, first of all, there's two main ways you can go about this. One is to simply have the back end code directly in the same directory as the front end. And the other main way is to have the front end and back end in separate directories. Now, as you might have guessed by the fact that I named this to-dos front end, what we're going to be doing here is the second one, and we're going to be creating an entirely new directory for our back end. This isn't necessary, but I do find that it helps keep things more organized when you don't have your code all in the same repository. So in order to generate the project for our backend, there's really no need to use a boilerplate generator like we did with our React project, because generally Node and Express projects tend to be a lot simpler. You'll see what I mean in just a minute. But first, let's open up a new terminal. And in fact, I'm just going to go back to the one that I used to create our front-end application. And I'm going to change directories back into where I keep my React projects. So that's just React for me. You're just going to want to change directories into wherever you want your Node project to be, your backend that is. And what we're going to do is we're just going to create a new directory using the make directory command. Now this is going to be different for you if you're on Windows, I believe. Right? Just look up how to create a new directory, Windows command line. And the same goes for any of these commands that I run if you're using Windows or some other kind of operating system besides a Mac. So the directory I'm going to create we'll call to-dos backend and hit enter, and then we're just going to change directories into that directory we just created and open that up in a separate IDE window. And there we go. So to set up a Node project, which will also include, by the way, Express, since Express is just the framework that we'll use to create our server. You'll see what that looks like shortly. The first thing we have to do is initialize this directory as an npm package. And the way we do that is by running the command npm init-y and hitting enter. And what that'll do is generate this package.json file, which will basically just contain some information about our project, such as scripts we can run, what dependencies our project has, the versioning of our project, etc. Our front end has the same kind of thing to keep track of its dependencies as well. And if you want to see a more complicated one, take a look at that. So the next thing that we're going to do, now that we've generated this package.json file, is we're going to install some of the packages we're going to be using on our backend to write our server. Now there's really two main packages we're going to be installing here. The first one is Express, and the second one is MongoDB. This is basically the package that will allow us to interact with a Mongo database via JavaScript. So we're going to install both of those by hitting enter. And you're going to see that node modules will appear, which is basically just all of the dependency code. That's kind of interesting stuff to look through if you're ever bored. And we also see that this package lock.json file has been generated. This basically just contains the exact versioning for all of our dependencies. And it's quite a lot bigger, as you can see, than our regular package.json file. All right, so now that we've installed Express and MongoDB into our backend directory, the next thing we're going to do is set up our server. And the way we're going to do that, we're going to start off by creating a new folder called source. And inside here, we're going to create a new file called server.js. And I just want to point out that the names that I've used here, right, source and server.js, these don't have to be the names. And this also doesn't have to be the directory structure of your backend, right? There's not really any kind of hard and fast rule behind how you should organize a backend project. So you could name this main.js, you could name it index.js, you could have the source folder just not even exist and have this JS file in the root directory. You know, whatever you want to do, but this is the way I usually prefer to do things because it kind of follows the same structure as on the front end. Okay, so inside this server code, what we're going to do is we're going to start off by creating a basic Express server. So I mentioned that Express is what's called a server framework. for Node.js. And all that means is that it just makes the process of creating a server that will respond to requests, that kind of thing, a lot easier than if we were to just write it using bare Node.js code. So that's why a lot of people use it. The way that we're going to set up a server, we're going to start off by importing it from its package. So we'll say const express equals require express. And this might be a different syntax than you're used to for importing packages. Okay, on the front end, for example, whenever we wanted to import something, we would just say import blank from blank, right? So we would say something like import use state from React if we wanted to use the use state hook. Okay? And the reason for that is that by default, Node.js wants us to use this import syntax, right? Instead of using the actual import keyword. Now I'll show you very shortly how we can actually fix that. But for now, we'll just write our imports using the require keyword. Okay, and now that we've imported Express, we're going to create a new server by saying const app equals Express, and we're going to call Express as a function, right? That's just how we create a new Express server. And the last thing we need to do is we need to tell Express that we want it to listen for requests on a given port by saying app.listen. And the first argument we pass here is going to be the port number we want it to listen on. Usually, just by convention, we use 8080 or 8000 for this port. Some of that will depend on what port your front end is running on, right? You can't have them running on the same port, obviously. So we're just going to use 8080 here. And the second argument here is a callback function that will be called once our server has successfully started. So usually what I like to do here is just say console.log and, maybe say something like server is listening on port 8080. Okay, and that is how you set up a basic Express server. So you can run this now by saying node and then the path to this file, so node source/server.js, and hitting enter. And you should see that it logs out server is listening on port 8080. Now, this server doesn't really do very much right now because we haven't added any endpoints, and what we're going to have to do is add endpoints for each of the different actions that we want our front end to be able to take, right? So we're going to need to have an endpoint for creating to-dos. Okay, so creating to-dos. We're going to have an endpoint for marking to-dos as completed, right? So we'll just call that updating. We're going to have one for deleting to-dos. And of course, we're going to have one for loading to-dos, which is usually referred to as reading. And as you can see, I've organized this so that the CRUD acronym is clearly visible. This is basically what that means in the context of web servers. So we're going to have to create endpoints for each of these, which is something that we'll get to a little later on. Before we do that, I just want to set up one rudimentary route that we'll be able to use just to make sure our server is actually responding to our requests. Now, the way we add a route to an Express server is by saying app.get, and then the first argument we pass here is the path that we want this endpoint to be listening on. So I'll just say something like test. And the second argument here is a callback function that will get called whenever our server receives a request on this endpoint that we've specified here, right? This path. Now, the way that this callback works is it takes two arguments, which we'll talk about in more detail a little bit later, and those are request and response. Now, the request argument is just an object that contains basic data about the request that was received, right? So, in other words, it contains information such as who the request came from, any additional data that was included with the request, etc. We'll see how to use that later on, as I said. And the second argument here is a response object, which we can use to actually send a response back to the client. So how this is going to work is, for this test route, we're just going to send back a very basic hello world response to the client by saying res.send, and we'll say something like hello from the backend. Okay, and that is how you write a very basic endpoint in Express. What we're going to do now is kill our server by pressing Control-C and restarting it in order to make those changes take effect. And what you should be able to do now is if you open up your browser and go to localhost 8080/test and hit enter, you should see that message that says hello from the backend printed out to the console. And that's how we set up a very basic backend for our application. We'll obviously be seeing how to add a lot more functionality to this as we build out our app, but for the meantime, it's good just to know that we have this working. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.